What was sort of the jump for you, from learning sign language to actually being involved in the deaf community? How did that happen? Was that like a natural progression, or was there some things that happened?
Yeah, it was. I mean, it's the deaf community is a community mainly of deaf people and family, children, who probably hearing children. And so as a hearing person coming into that community, there's no real justification for being part of that community. And so having a productive role to provide a resource for that community is a useful, mutually beneficial thing.
Yes.
And so you're pretty much part of the deaf community straight away as you start learning sign language, because you're obviously learning from a deaf tutor who is part of the community. They're encouraging you to go out and meet deaf people at deaf events, deaf club, things like that occasionally. But I mean, I see myself as the deaf community is more my community than anything else. I don't have any other groups. I don't go to church. I don't necessarily, I'm not part of a big corporate company where there's a social club or anything like that. So as far as identity goes, yeah, I was born in England, I'm a Kiwi, but my community is the deaf community. And so I want to have a useful role in that community, which otherwise has much less resources than the average community in New Zealand.
Yes. And do you find that the deaf community, because obviously we're designed, society's designed for spoken communication rather than gesturing communication, rather than sign language. Do you find that means that it's, in some ways, society's quite close to the deaf community, and that perhaps they more kind of function as within their own community more? What sort of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, society, as you say, is designed more for spoken languages than sign languages, mainly just through a lack of knowledge, I think. But it's true. So I think because of that, the deaf community has had to provide its own resources.
Yeah.
So I think it's made the community quite robust, quite resilient, quite creative, inventive. So information becomes a currency. So if one person learns some information, they're going to want to pass that on. I mean, if you found a deaf person that knows something of importance and they didn't tell anybody else, that would be a kind of weird cultural thing to do. Whereas in the mainstream society, information is so abundant that you don't really need to pass on anything else. You're more likely to pass on pictures of your lunch or various different things like that of less importance.
Yes.
And so that, the way society is structured, I think, has affected the deaf community in frustrating and positive ways.
Yes.
Yeah. But a deaf person might have a different answer to that question, because they're living it rather than just observing it.
Yes. What are sort of the elements, sort of obviously for you, kind of being part of both communities, or, being able to be fluent in both languages, what are the things, the considerations that you might, when you're communicating sign language, that you'd have to consider that you wouldn't consider, both, I suppose, positive, that could be a positive or a negative, but what are the sort of things? I mean, I'm just thinking sort of, even on a sort of really simplistic level, sort of, just needing to face someone, which is quite different. I think often in English, we can be at, especially in the work context, we can actually be talking to someone which isn't healthy at all. We can, be working on the computer, someone's talking to us, we're answering back without even turning around, which is not a good practice. But, what would be the things then that you would sort of consider then, or would change, from translating from one to the other?
So there's a couple of things there. I mean, one aspect is access to information.
Yeah.
So when you're interpreting, you can't assume that a deaf person has the same sort of general knowledge that a hearing person might take for granted, because we're just swamped with information, written form on the internet or newspapers or your phone, overhearing it on the bus, friends at parties. There's information everywhere.
Yes. And
you generally can't help but pick it up because you can't close your ears, right?
Yes. Yeah.
But a deaf person might not have had that experience. So it's when you're interpreting and a hearing person is saying something, you're constantly having to think, okay, is it likely that the deaf person knows this? And if not, then you need to do a quick little explanation in some ways. Sometimes you don't, depending on the context. Obviously, if it's a courtroom, you don't, because it's much more literal in what you do. But generally, we say part of our role is cultural mediation. And so if we just interpreted like a machine, which has been a model of interpreting in the past.
So it's literally the words and being very precise with...
So no context, no sort of semantic attachment.
Yes.
It wouldn't necessarily make sense. Because if you took the words of someone from one culture and just transposed them into your own culture, you might get a vague understanding of what it's about, but you may not understand all the subtext and all the real meaning that's trying to be expressed in that utterance.
It's so fascinating. Would you be able to give an example of perhaps a phrase or a word, and then how would you translate that into sign language?
One common one might be the word oral, for example, has come up a few times. So the term oral, so O-R-A-L, in the hearing world is a fairly benign term meaning vocal.
Yes.
All right. So if you give an oral submission to a select committee, just means that you're talking to the committee. You haven't got anything written down necessarily. You're there talking face to face. But you use that word oral in a deaf context, and it's got a whole load of baggage around it, because oral or oralism was a whole form of education for 100 years, from the late 1880s through to about the mid-70s in New Zealand, which meant that deaf children weren't allowed to sign in schools. All right, so they had to learn how to lip read and speak as close to a hearing person as possible.
Wow.
And so that had a massive impact on their education, because it takes so much time to do that. And so obviously some children are not able to pick that up, because it's incredibly difficult to be able to vocalize and lip read a language as you're learning it. You imagine trying to learn Mandarin only from lip reading and saying it with headphones on. It's incredibly difficult. There'd be so many
times when you would miss because if you didn't see someone's mouth, you know.
Exactly right. So fairly oppressive.
Very oppressive.
Yeah, I mean, there were some people that it suited and liked it, but the vast majority would likely say that it was a fairly horrific time, certainly for the language and the culture.
Yes.
So fortunately, there were residential schools in Auckland and Christchurch, and that's where the language, the sign language, carried on, because as soon as the teachers were out of the way, the kids would still sign to each other, because it was just easier, obviously. And so that's how the language maintained itself. So so if someone was to say to a deaf person, government's open, they're very keen to hear your oral submission. If you just interpreted that literally, a deaf person might be quite annoyed and say, well, I'm not going to go and speak verbally to a committee. Why would they do that? Why are they still oppressing my language?
Yes. So you might just change slightly the interpretation.
Well, you'd focus on the meaning of what oral is,
right? Not
just the term oral.
Yes.
So you'd think, okay, well, oral actually means you can go there and you can just sign, because this can be oral as well.
Okay.
It doesn't have to be vocal, you know?
Yes.
So things like that's a vague example, but that's the general principle.
That's a good example. No, I think that's a good example. Absolutely.